Everyone, welcome back. So today I'm going to be covering the round 9 game between Liren and Jan-Krzysztof Duda. This was a very interesting struggle, so I wanted to look over it. There were actually 3 decisive games. Caruana and Nepo drew, but all the other games were decisive. So I wanted to cover this game because I think that the other games have received a lot of attention on different channels, different outlets. So I think I just want to look at this game. This doesn't really have any serious bearing on the tournament. But I think this is actually a really good presentation of, Ding's play. So it was in English with c4, knight f6, g3, e6, bishop g2, d5, and usually White tries to play this line to avoid a Catalan. Of course, he could go into a Catalan. So, for example, if something like bishop e7, then d4 is just a mainline Catalan, and the game goes on. Instead of this, Duda decided to take on c4. And this is an interesting move. So basically, black tries to just take this pawn. Actually, in a lot of Catalan situations, you also can take on c4. So white recovers it with queen a4, knight bd7. Now, just an interesting note, if something like knight c6, this is a very well-known trap with knight e5, and white should be positionally much better, if not close to winning. So something like bishop d7, you just take this, you give a check, and then you recover the pawn, and white is basically just a pawn up for nothing. The only thing white has to really worry about here is the weakness on this diagonal, specifically the light squares, but that's pretty easy to manage. The other try, instead of knight c6, which is just it's a mistake, is bishop d7, which has been played before, and here it reaches a position where white gets this knight e5 move in quickly to remove this bishop, and then this bishop will have no opponent. That's the point. So yeah, so after something like this, you can just take, and white gets exactly what he wants. This was, for example, a recent game between Kramnik and Nepo, where Kramnik actually lost, but he got a good position from the opening here. But anyways, let's go back. So queen a4 was played, knight bd7, blocking with the knight. It makes some sense to do this because you're basically, it looks a little bit awkward, but it makes sense to just not play bishop d7 because knight e5 will be a problem. So queen takes c4, white recovers the pawn. a6, just intending b5, bishop b7, and then this is actually exactly what black wants because he'll be able to combat this light-scored bishop on g2. If black manages to do that in these positions, then usually he's okay. White's real idea here is to keep this bishop alive and make sure it gets as strong as possible. So queen c2 preempts b5. So now something like b5, you could just play knight d4. This is a very, very uncomfortable thing to deal with. So for example, knight d5 blocking it isn't really ideal because you get knight c6 in. And I mean, after something like this, you could play e4. And, black has to go into this, and the rook is hit, the knight is still hit, the light-squared bishop is gone. So that's not a good move. So that's why b5 is not played here. Instead, c5, which makes a lot more sense. You're just basically trying to grab some space in the center. If white plays d4, maybe you can capture it, and it's just a way to basically just gain space in the center. Knight c3, and now queen c7. And this move is a little bit mysterious to me, honestly. So I was trying to figure out why queen c7 and why not something like bishop e7 first. In this case, for example, if white were to castle, let's say black castles, d4 is actually annoying. And this gives white a pretty good edge. This was a game between Nepo and Aleksenko from Ekaterinburg 2021. I believe that was the Candidates Tournament, if I'm not mistaken, last year's Candidates Tournament. But yeah, Nepo got a very good game out of this and won. But yeah, so basically, white has very nice pieces. These bishops look amazing. The rooks will naturally come to c8, and black still has to fix the problem with the bishop on c8. So that's why this is not really played. But the other point is, for example, after, let's say queen c7 now, instead of black castling, what's the difference? Well, now d4 is strong, and if black, let's say, tries to play b5, you can play bishop f4 here. After queen b6, you can go into this variation, where you basically, okay, you hit the rook, so bishop b7 blocks. And it looks like black is okay here until this move knight e4, which hits d6, opens up this diagonal, attacks the bishop, of course. And it's just a very uncomfortable position to play. If something like bishop e7, I think knight d6 is pretty strong because you're going to force these the bishops off. The king will not be able to castle. Just not ideal for black. In fact, I think the engine says black is probably losing here. But that's the difference. So, but in this case, after something like queen c7, if white were to play d4 in this case, that's a little bit different. Because note how white is not castled here. And the other variation, after bishop e7 castles, then queen c7, the white king was already on g1. This is different because black can now play b5, and this actually works because after bishop f4, and then you take on c5, and f2 is hit. And that's the difference. That's why queen c7 is played. It's a really weird nuance. I was just curious why people did that before playing bishop e7, and I think that's the answer. Is that in a lot of cases, this bishop f4 move might be very annoying with d4, and white just gets a good game out of that. Here b6 was played, so the intention is pretty clear. Black just wants to play bishop b7. And everything will be okay. If knight e5, of course, you might be able to even take this, but I think just bishop b7 is okay. So d4, Ding breaks in the center, and now bishop b7. Now I do want to make a quick note of something. If this is taken, well, it's just losing because of bishop f4. And let's say something like e5. This is actually seen in a game between Peter Skelly and I'm not sure how to pronounce their name, Purna Sharma Mithrakanth. They're both master level players, like one's 2400, one's 2300. And this position actually occurred, and white almost got the advantage. He just had to spot something after knight d7, knight fd7. So the point here is that yes, white gives up this piece, but this pin it's very difficult to deal with. That's one. And after queen a4, the lines are very forcing. Of course, if bishop d7, you just take here, and this is completely winning. Let me just show you that real quick. So you just take here, and then if something like this, you could actually just take this rook, and that's over. So pretty sharp game here. So knight fd7. Now, you don't want to take this rook too quickly because then the knight falls, right? That makes sense. So instead, you have to play knight d5 here, queen b8, and now you take, and then you play knight b6, and this is extremely strong for for white. Black has really no way out of this. After rook c1, you can't really take this knight because of rook c8, and you can't take here because of the pin. So this is like a very, very uncomfortable position to play. Something like bishop c5. White can take the bishop on c8 and then play b4, and he wins back the material with basically a winning position. The bishop is very powerful. Black is still not castled. This pin is extremely annoying. But this is a computer variation, of course. It was seen in a game, but not to such accuracy. But anyways, that's why c takes d4 is not played. Instead, bishop b7, which makes more sense because you want to cover this diagonal. D takes c5. Bishop takes. And now bishop f4. So basically here, black doesn't really want to retreat because then this bishop has a beautiful diagonal. Instead, black countered this bishop with bishop d6. If something like e5, this doesn't work because of knight takes. And if takes, you just take on b7 first, and then you take the knight, and that's a piece 1. So that's not working. So e5 is not good. So bishop d6. This was taken, and now rook d1. Very simple moves. And now this move really caught me by surprise. I think in every other game here, there were 4 games. One of them was actually Aronian versus Wojciech, which went like this. It went rook a c1, and they got a position that was pretty symmetrical. And the pieces were exchanged, and eventually they fizzled out into a draw. Instead of that, I think this was actually Ding's prep. Or maybe it was just pretty good creativity over the board. Rook d4. What a cool move. It's an interesting rook lift. Basically, he's holding a lot of these squares. But I think the other point is that he was trying to basically trick black into playing something like e5, which isn't good at all. e5 weakens this square and this square. And for example, white can retreat. And then after something like, let's say, castles, you can play knight h4, hopping into f5. And if the bishops are exchanged, no problem, because now knight e3, and this knight, one of these knights are going to land on d5. And it's extremely strong for white. So this is actually, like, I think the idea here is that e5 cannot be played. It's like a provocation. This rook is actually really well positioned here. It can't be easily kicked off. So castles was played, and now rook ad1, and this is very simple play. I mean, look, the rooks are beautiful. They're coordinating. If you look at this position compared to the game between Aronian and Wojciech, which was, let me go back a little bit, which was here, you can see how in this position, the rooks are placed in the back rank. But let's compare it to how Ding did it. Beautiful coordination. They're much better on this d file than they are on the rook is much better on d4 and d1 than they are on c1 and d1. It's a very interesting difference. I'm almost certain this was Ding's prep, or maybe he just had this idea over the board. Maybe he was aware of this idea at some point, but really interesting, like a really interesting way to play. So rook a c8, it's standard procedure. And queen d2, just stepping out of the line of the queen and the rook. You really don't want to invite any sort of b5 stuff. Good move here, just piling up on the d file. Now the knight is threatened, so you do want to move that. Knight c5. And now this really good move here, queen f4. So black's threat is now to play e5. And the difference is that at some point black could play e4 and white will just not have time to do any of these crazy maneuvers. And the rook will also not be able to retreat to a good square. So that is a threat, and queen f4 is a perfect response to that. So for example, I'll give an example. It's something like h3. White just sits around and waits. Then e5 is a really strong move. And the rook is kind of uncomfortable because he can't move to any of these squares. He could move here, but then just b5. And this is a really uncomfortable position to play. So he has to go to, like, let's say h4, and now just rook fd8, and white's whole initiative is gone. And actually, white here is just much worse. Black has very good control over the center. This e-pawn is actually cramping white. And black has beautiful development. This bishop makes a lot of sense. The rooks actually now don't make sense at all because they're not connected. So I think black is actually much better here. But anyways, let's go back. So a good response to this is queen f4. Just preventing e5. Now this cannot be played. So this was exchanged, and now pawn takes. Very vital to not take with the rook, because after something like knight d5, white just loses the initiative very quickly. You could, again, play rook d4 here. You could try that, but this pawn will fall. So it's actually not good. You break the coordination of the rooks. Instead, pawn takes. And this looks like a really bad structure, double pawns. But it's actually okay. And this f-pawn you'll see later in the game is actually really useful. So knight ec4. And now this was exchanged. And now knight e5. Now, I'm going to go back a little bit. If something like knight d5, you can just take this and then play knight e5. And again, you get this position where if, for example, the bishops are exchanged, white is actually doing much better here because he has the control of the d file. The knight is beautifully placed. Black would had to play f6. This is just an example. But black would have to play f6 to kick the knight. And after something like knight f3, just rerouting the knight into a better square, this is really not ideal. So for example, if black were to just wait around like this, then rook d6 is a really annoying move. But of course, I'm just, that's just an example. The knight, after the rook moves, the knight can come in to either c6 or e6. Then I can reroute at some point, maybe f5 would be a move. It's just not comfortable for black to play with all these weaknesses here. So that is why knight d5 wasn't played. I mean, I also didn't play the best moves for black. I'm sure black can do better, but it's just an example to show you just how badly this can turn out for black. So knight ce4 instead. And Duda probably welcomed exchanges here. Knight e5. And then bishop d5. I do want to make a note, again, if these bishops are exchanged, which looks like this is what black wants. Let's say rook c2, which looks active. If this is all exchanged, this pawn can just be defended, and now white has this annoying move e4 coming. And the rook will once again control this file. Like, you can't play rook d8 here because e4. Oh, not e4, knight takes f4 wins. But let's say just f5. This is actually a key move. It shows up a lot in this game. You basically try to undermine this pawn, and you create a very annoying weakness on e6. So that is why this is not really an ideal endgame for black to play. This f-pawn is a real resource. So instead of that, he played bishop d5 in the hopes that if this is exchanged, then of course just knight takes, and actually this knight is okay, because again e4 is not possible because of knight takes f4. So this knight's pretty well placed. The king would probably have to come up to cover this pawn before e4 can be played. But black has a lot of options there. So instead of that, bishop d5, and now Ding just played the move a4. First of all, getting the pawn away from the diagonal of the bishop, but also cramping black's queen side here for a little bit. So if something like, let's say, b5, then a5 is really annoying, and this might become a weakness. Black really doesn't want to push this b pawn. It'll become, not at this point, but even if something like rook b8, b4, it's just not good. The b pawn is too weak, and it might be picked up. So that's one idea. So a5 was played. This is just, I guess, to prevent this move at all in the future. Maybe b4 wasn't on the cards. So a5. But this does create a square on b5, and we'll see how that actually impacts the game in the future. Maybe a5 was just not the best move here. Maybe he should have given his king an escape square. And the reason I say that, this is, again, hindsight. So, I mean, in a lot of cases, black has back rank issues, and this insertion of h6 is actually necessary, I think. So, but instead, a5, okay. Now e4. And, of course, bishops can't move like knights, so bishop takes f4 is not a thing. So the bishop has to move. So bishop b3, basically just trying to hold on to this pawn and hit the rook. Now, maybe it was actually prudent to just exchange everything quickly. And if, for example, knight takes again, this move f5 is like really annoying to me, because white will create another weakness, and this knight will be untouchable. Something like e3, f4 at some point, maybe king f2, of course, before any of that is done, just to protect the e-pawn. And if this knight is solidified on e5, black will have a very hard time defending this. So maybe that was what he should have done. But let's say if, for example, e takes, but then this is an isolated pawn, and white can just play all day against this pawn here. This is also a weakness. Maybe at some point rook d3, rook b3 is an idea. For example, the game can go f3, rook c2. I'm just playing natural moves here. Rook d2, trying to exchange things off. King f2, and slowly but surely, things are actually turning in white's favor. So, for example, if something like rook d8, just to cover this, I believe even just like king d3 is strong, just to get to this queen side somehow, or maybe even come up here. Basically, white's king is active, and these pawns are still weak, and white can play this all day. I was almost certain that there was also a move rook d3 here, although I'm not sure if this is working here. Maybe something like rook d6 is a good move, just to cover these pawns and hold everything together. But anyways, instead of that, e4 was played, and I think this just gave black a little bit to play for, because now he has just a tiny bit of activity here. So rook d3, hitting the bishop, and now rook c1. Bishop f1, and now in this case we could see how this bishop is pinned, and this bishop is actually kind of annoying. So bishop c2, and now rook c3. Now you obviously cannot take this pawn. That is not ideal because your rook hangs. Sorry for the clicking. So rook d1 was played. Again, this bishop is not free because the rook hangs. So rook takes d1, bishop takes. And now rook c4 just to cover the e4 pawn. And now rook d8. Very simple moves. Duda is fighting back here. Knight c6. Now this is actually a very interesting point of the game. And I don't know if Duda missed this, because in hindsight maybe he should have played bishop b3 first before rook d8. But rook d8 runs into a very annoying tactic, which is knight c6. And then after rook d2, knight takes a5. And this is why I said that h6 should have been included, because rook c8 is an issue. This is just a free pawn. So maybe instead of this, instead of rook d8, he should have played here bishop b3, and I'll explain why. So, for example, after this, if rook d8, knight c6, the rook can't stay on the back rank. It's just not going to work. If, for example, rook f8, which looks like a ridiculous move. Now, I do want to make it clear that this is not working because of knight e7. So, but let's just say rook e8, just to show you the point of this. Now rook d4, and white controls a d file. You cannot challenge white on this file here. After bishop b3, let's say bishop b5 is extremely annoying. This is a very annoying bishop here in combination with the knight and the rook and these defended pawns. White can just play f3, king f2, king e3, and slowly keep making progress. So black can really not stay on the back rank. So like, yeah, that's why it's not working. If something instead, let's say like rook f8, which looks like the safest move to play. Again, rook d4, and you just hit this bishop, and that buys you time to get on the d file. Bishop b3 anyways, let's say. Now king g2, and the idea is to just basically bring this king over and then play f3. Something like h6, and now just bishop b5, and white is doing amazing here. White has a great position. So that's not working either. Let's just make one more move. Like, let's say rook a8. It looks ridiculous, but let's just give it a try. Rook d4, same idea. And in this case, for example, white will just get a very strong position. In this case, actually, it's a funny little trap. The bishop is completely trapped. It has nowhere to go. This is just an example of how bad it can turn out for black. So instead of this, rook d2 was played. Knight takes a5. Rook c8 is made. So g6 had to be played. You could also play, I think you could also play h6 here. But maybe not, because after king h7, there's a move knight c4, and then I think this f7 pawn will become very weak. So it's not that simple. So g6, rook c8, and now knight c4. And the point of rook c8 was to just give the knight room, because if the knight goes back to b3, this pawn is just picked up. So rook c8 was forced, and now knight c4 defends the pawn for the moment. Rook c2, just obviously hanging onto the rook. Now b4, just getting rid of the b pawn from the second rank. It's not going to be threatened anymore. And now rook c1, and the threat is bishop e2. So we avoid that with knight takes b6. For the moment, white is up 2 pawns. These pawns look really scary. But actually, black just picks it up. Rook b1. Bishop e2 was not possible because of rook takes rook. So rook b1 to try and pick up that pawn. And now king g2, stepping out of that pin. Again, bishop e2 was threatened, and the only real way to get out of it was with king g2. Now rook takes b4, and now a5. Now, the computer is going to tell me 0-0. But I think for a human being to defend against a passed pawn like this, with an active knight, rook, and a very well-placed bishop here that's covering a6 and could eventually come out to g2, it's a very annoying position to hold, because this is not easy to collect. And this bishop is the right square color for that corner. So that's extremely annoying to play. Duda here played rook b3. And that's I think that move was intended to cut off the king from coming to like something like f3, but this is covered anyways, and I'm not sure what rook b3 was trying to do. Maybe get behind the pawn. Rook c1. This is basically forced, because let's say if something like rook c7, then bishop f3 is really annoying. And this is actually, now this is impossible to break. Bishop e2 is coming. So maybe actually, like, and actually I just realized this, maybe rook b3 was just a way to get bishop f3 in. Duh. rook c1, bishop f3, king g1, and now rook a3, and he tries to get behind the pawn here. Knight c4, just hits the rook and holds onto the pawn at the same time. Rook a2, and now knight e5, and this knight has landed on a very nice outpost here. Attacking f3 and attacking f7. Of course, f7 is not hanging yet, but it's a very difficult pawn to hold. So here Duda played bishop takes e4, and as we'll see in the game, this was a mistake. The computer variation here is bishop h5. This looks ridiculous. But the point is that after rook c7, which looks like you're just winning this pawn outright, there's this insane move, g5, allowing the bishop to defend the f7 square. And this is actually a really complicated variation to calculate, because a6 is going to be played anyways, and this is a very difficult pawn to keep a hold of. So something like this, king g2, and now let's say this. This is like the computer variation, by the way. I don't think a human being would see this very easily. And this is actually really hard to keep a hold of. This pawn might eventually start pushing, and this rook is kind of tied down to this pawn. These pieces are on the opposite side of where they should be. So I think it's not that easy for black to play this at all. I think white, if anything, white has winning chances here. Like for example, you could easily blunder here. If you make some move like king e5, for example, just rook c5 is very strong. Like king f4, rook c4, you can chase the king away. And here, like rook a4 is just winning. So like little tricks like that exist in the position. And I think this would be very difficult to see, especially like bishop h5 and then g5, and just calculating all this out and making sure that it works is ridiculous. So I don't think that's what he would have played. So bishop takes e4 is human, and it makes sense why he did that. But rook c7 picks up the f7 pawn. There's really no way to stop this. Knight d5, rook takes f7, and king g8. And now a6, a very simple move. Just push the pawn forward. It was hanging, so now it's just complete. Now it's covered by the bishop, and the king is actually pretty safe. There's really no way to get to it. If you try something like rook a1, a7 is just completely crushing. You can't even play bishop d3 because this knight is keeping a hold of it. So that's not working. So knight b4 tries to collect the pawn. And now rook a7. If you were to play here a7, it looks okay, but actually knight c6 is a really good move. Deflecting the knight from the protection of the rook, and also trying to win back this pawn. And there's really nothing that white can do to stop this. This pawn is going to be gone, and the game will probably peter out into a draw. But that's a really nice trick that exists here. So you shouldn't rush it with a7. Rook a7 is a really good move, just holding the pawn. Knight c6, and now rook c7. Now obviously the knight's not hitting the a pawn. If, for example, knight takes knight, this is actually absolutely fine for white. This is winning, because at some point the bishop might exchange itself, and this rook with the rook on the 7th with this passed a pawn will win the game. Or even something like bishop c4, I think, is a more clear-cut way of doing it. Just attacking e6. Maybe you could even come around to c6. Just a very unfortunate position to play. White's plan here is to really get this king to b1 and maybe try to chase the rook. I mean, the bishop here is here for now, but it's just to chase the rook away and try to get this pawn through. So knight d4, f3, a really strong move. Now I do want to show you something. If, for example, knight takes f3 was played, but if bishop takes, you don't play knight takes because you get mated instantly with rook h2 here. So that's not working. But instead of knight takes, you play bishop c4. What a great move. Keeping an eye on this pawn and giving the king a square to escape. So this is threatened, and then basically once this bishop is gone, this bishop is very strong, and it will caress the pawn all the way forward. So something like, let's say, rook a5 just to hit the knight. a7. Let's say all these checks mean nothing. And basically white will just promote very easily. That's just an example line. So f3, really good move. Knight takes, and it looks like for the moment this bishop is actually holding this diagonal, and maybe it's not so obvious. But a7, And now bishop d5. Again, like, you can't really play here this because it's not going to work. You're going to lose the pawn. So it's not working. Bishop g2 is not working. So he has to find something else. He played here h4. I think it was to just get this rook away from this h-pawn and give his king a little bit more room to breathe in the case that this rook moves. But I think more importantly, this pawn was just on h2, and I think when he wants to move his king, he doesn't want that h2 pawn to hang. So rook a4, trying to collect the f-pawn. I mean, also, I don't even think that this works. So like bishop b5, for example, if this is bishop b5 was played, but if this is taken, then just bishop c6 wins on the spot because this is threatened. And if you were to take, you cannot actually win this now because this is completely winning. Well, not win this now. Black has no chance of winning here, of course, but basically this is a trick, is that at some point the bishop can come to c6, cover this diagonal, and then promote. So black really has to stay on the a file. So rook a5, and the Dane just ignores it. This bishop can, again, not be taken. If this is taken, then just rook takes d5, and the pawn promotes. So that's not working. So rook here. King f1, and white starts to slowly move his king to the queen side. Bishop g2 was tried. King e1, bishop d5, and the king just slowly... I'm not sure what king h8 even was, by the way. King c1. Now, this for the moment does stop the white king from coming. And now rook c7, just covering the c2 square. We don't want any kind of rook c2 checks. Rook a5, and now just a very simple bishop d7 attacking this pawn. This pawn is still here, and this bishop cannot touch it. As long as this rook defends it, this bishop cannot touch it. So like, the rook defends it, this rook is attacking it, but this bishop can't join the game. So it's really hard for black to even try to get to this pawn. Not only that, this king is like cut off completely. So it's really just difficult for black to try to deal with this pawn, especially since it's one square away from queening. The rook is tied down to the a file as well. So just a very miserable position here for black. Rook a1 was tried, but now king b2, and this is exactly what white wanted. Once he's on the a file, this is over. This was the last move of the game. Basically, what's going to happen is, let's say if the rook tries to just stick around, I'll play a random move like this. Then this is falling, and this is already winning. Something like king f8 is just not good. You can try to do this, but this pawn is dropping, and in any case, even if white doesn't promote this should just be a win. This bishop cannot keep a hold of everything. It cannot keep a hold of this pawn and the a8 square. It's overloaded. The other point is that, for example, basically there's no move for black. And if we go back a little bit, instead of, let's say, rook a1 after bishop d7, what would have happened if he were to play like something like rook a6? Well, now king b2, the same story. The king will just come up and slowly shove this rook away and position himself in a way where he can play bishop c6 safely. Like, let's say king g8, and the king just comes up. I could even play some more moves here. I'll just play like king f8, king here, and this is just completely winning. And you really cannot step on the second rank. This bishop is doing an excellent job of stopping this king from coming. If you step on the second rank, bishop b5 just wins instantly. So that's not working. And the very simple plan is just to bring this king here, play bishop c6 safely, and then just promote this pawn. So that's why here Duda resigned on the move king a4. So an excellent game by Ding. It's really hard to see where he even made a mistake. I think he actually played like basically a perfect game here. Just to start off, I really liked, first of all, I think Duda's opening choice was okay. But I think that after d4, this really interesting idea with rook d4, very nice idea. Just trying to double the rooks. Instead of bringing the rooks to c1 and d1, why not double? Very nice idea. And then basically slowly controlling the position. Queen f4 is an excellent move, and then taking with the pawn is an excellent decision. It looks like white has a very bad structure, but actually white has a great structure here, and this pawn is a very nice resource. And after all these piece exchanges, this endgame was just a very nicely played by Ding. I think a5 was a mistake because you're giving up the b5 square and you're making a weakness on b6. Maybe Duda should have reconsidered another move. Again, I think h6, I mean, in hindsight, with all the back rank issues that black had, h6 should have just been played. And black should have just held steady and not done anything. So yeah, that was an interesting game. But if we just go a little bit forward, I'm going to cover all the little moments of the game. Bishop b3, maybe e4 was a little bit premature, but I wouldn't call this a mistake. I wouldn't even call it an inaccuracy. I think that it just gave black a little bit to play for. But Ding handled it beautifully. Rook c4, very solid moves. Rook d8. And this knight c6 tactic here, with knight takes a5, nice find by Ding. And then just the way he maneuvered his pieces and basically created problems for black was just impeccable here. This endgame is very difficult to hold for black. This pawn is just so difficult to keep control of, especially with these active pieces here. So, yeah, I mean, Duda just got into a very tough situation where he was a pawn down in an endgame that's already very difficult to hold. And, like, doing stuff like this, it didn't really help at all. White managed to organize all his pieces, and I think Duda's last chance was to find some ridiculous bishop h5. This is the kind of... I think that the difference between computers and humans is a computer would find bishop h5 in a matter of seconds, and it would go through all the calculations, like all the only moves, very quickly. For a human being to find this in this sort of position, all it means is that white has posed black so many issues that you have to find ridiculous moves to survive. If white has achieved that, then it's almost always a win. It takes a lot of very, like, basically a brain made of, like, computer parts to play like this, to just accept that rook c7, g5, and then allow white to play a6 and get all these things in, and then, you know, cut the king off entirely. And, you know, just to play like this as a human being is near impossible. So, but I think Ding created such circumstances where in this position black had no other option but to take here, because bishop h5 was just too much to calculate or to see through. It wasn't obvious. And after this, Ding converted beautifully, controlling the pawn, making sure that black had no counterplay. This move f3, this is a great move. Just basically forcing exchanges where white is just completely winning. As long as he can just get this bishop into the game and his king into the game, he's winning with this pawn. A7, and this is already completely lost. Just an excellent game. Ding just controlled the situation, never let up, and every move Duda made was just making his position worse. But yeah, a great game by Ding. I'm actually going to leave the final position on the board here. I mean, look at these pieces. Look at this pawn. This is over for black. This king is very active. So yeah, a great game. Now I want to look at the standings for now. So Ian Nepomniachtchi is still in the lead with 6.5 out of 9. It looks like he's going to win the tournament. If Caruana can't catch up to him, I think Nepo is probably going to win. Caruana on 5.5 out of 9. Hikaru and Ding on 4.5 out of 9. I'm really rooting for Ding. I really hope that he finishes off strongly. And the rest are on, well, not the rest, but Rajaba, Firouzja, Rapport are on 4 out of 9, and Duda is on 3 out of 9. I feel bad. I mean, Firouzja was also kind of on the bottom of the tournament, but Duda had a really great year, actually, and a great 2021 as well. So I don't think this is Duda's full potential. I think at his best, Duda can totally compete with people like Magnus. But yeah, an excellent game by Ding. Great performance. I hope that he keeps it up in this tournament. I will see you in round 10. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your night or day or week.